On the 8th of November 1954, on a golf course outside Wellington called Heretaunga, a slight, quiet 18-year-old bank clerk from a small Wairarapa town stood over a putt that would finish 2 strokes clear of Bruce Crampton and 4 ahead of Peter Thomson. 2 Australians who, within a decade, would between them collect 6 Open Championships and become the most feared golfing names south of the equator. For a man in Melbourne or Sydney following the wireless reports that week, the result must have seemed almost impossible to credit. A boy nobody outside New Zealand had heard of, still an amateur, still working behind a counter for a living, had simply outplayed the 2 best golfers Australasia had. It was the first time the wider world heard the name Bob Charles, and it would not be the last time he arrived somewhere quietly and left having rewritten what people thought was possible. He was born in Carterton on the 14th of March 1936, a small town threaded through the Wairarapa district of New Zealand's North Island, sheep country and dairy country, the kind of place where a boy's horizons were set by the hills and the weather and not much else. What made him unusual from the very beginning was an accident of inheritance rather than design. Both his parents played golf, and both of them played left-handed. There was no junior coaching program, no talent pathway, none of the apparatus that surrounds a promising boy today. There was simply a spare set of his mother's and father's clubs leaning in a corner, and a boy who, for all that he wrote and ate and did everything else in life with his right hand, picked up those clubs the only way they were built to be swung. It is one of golf's small ironies that the man who would become the most famous left-handed player in the sport's history was, by every other measure, right-handed. He learned the game back to front, in a manner of speaking, and never saw any reason to change it. The family's fortunes took the young Charles first to Masterton, where as a teenager he took a position as a bank teller, the standard, respectable, faintly grey path for a bright boy without money for anything else in that era. While his golf continued to sharpen in the background, evenings and weekends, on courses that in some cases were barely more than paddocks with flags in them. It is worth pausing on that image for a moment. A boy in a bank uniform, counting out other men's money across a counter by day, walking home past unpaved streets to practice a putting stroke that would one day be called the finest in the world. There was nothing in the surroundings of Carterton or Masterton to suggest what was coming. And then, in 1954, it came anyway. Consider the sheer improbability of the arithmetic involved. New Zealand in the middle of the 20th century was, by any measure, a small golfing nation. Its courses modest, its playing population thin, its best amateurs rarely tested against the standards set by the professional circuits of Britain, America, and Australia. Australia across the Tasman, by contrast, was already producing golfers of genuine world standing. Peter Thomson would go on to win 5 Open Championships through the 1950s and into the following decade, a run of dominance almost without parallel in the sport's history. And Bruce Crampton would carve out a long and successful career on the American tour. That a Wairarapa bank clerk, playing on courses that would not have troubled a serious groundsman, could step onto the same fairway as these 2 men and simply outscore them, remains one of the more startling debuts world golf produced in that entire decade. That New Zealand Open victory did not immediately tip him into professional golf, and this in itself says something about the man's temperament. Where a more restless or more mercenary competitor might have turned professional on the spot and chased the money while the name was hot, Charles chose patience. He went back to the New Zealand Amateur Championship the following year and reached the final, only to lose. He reached the final again in 1956 and lost again. A pattern of near misses that would recur, in various forms, at the very highest level of the sport for the rest of his career, and which never seemed to dent the calm exterior he presented to the world. In 1956, he moved to Christchurch, on New Zealand's South Island, a shift that would eventually make Canterbury as much a home to him as the Wairarapa of his boyhood. And that same year, he represented New Zealand against Australia in an international amateur match and won his singles contest. Another early thread in a rivalry and friendship with Australian golf that would run the length of his career, long before he ever set foot on an Australian professional tour. By 1958, the wider golfing world had begun to take notice. and he traveled to Britain and the United States, still carrying his amateur status like a badge of quiet stubbornness. He received an invitation to play in the Masters at Augusta National, remarkable enough for a New Zealand amateur in that era, and he reached the quarter-finals of the Amateur Championship in Scotland, though his first tilt at the Open Championship itself, that same year, ended in a missed cut. He was chosen for New Zealand's team in the inaugural Eisenhower Trophy, the sport's premier amateur team event, and the New Zealanders led for a time before finishing fourth, good enough to confirm that the boy from Carterton belonged on the biggest amateur stages in the game, not yet good enough to win outright. 6 years passed between that first New Zealand Open title and his decision, in October 1960, to finally turn professional. 6 years behind a bank counter, 6 years of amateur golf played for the pure discipline of it, 6 years in which almost any other prodigy would have cashed in far sooner. Whatever else can be said about Bob Charles, he was never a man in a hurry to be told he had arrived. Professional golf, once he committed to it, did not keep him waiting long. He won a tournament almost immediately after turning pro and reached the final of the New Zealand PGA Championship before the year was out. The following year, 1961, he claimed that title outright, and with the meagre prize money and opportunities available to a professional in New Zealand at the time, he did what nearly every talented golfer of his generation from that part of the world had to do. He went overseas to find a living. South Africa and Europe absorbed him through 1961. He won the Bowmaker tournament and posted a string of good finishes, though his first crack at the Open Championship as a professional ended again in a missed cut. He came home and won the Caltex tournament and a second New Zealand PGA Championship, evidence enough that whatever he was learning abroad, he had lost nothing of his touch on home soil. In 1962, the itinerary widened further still. Asia and Europe, a runner-up finish in the Malayan Open, a tied 25th at the Masters, a tie for first in the Dax tournament, a 5th place finish at the Open Championship at Troon, 2nd place in the French Open and in the Irish Hospitals tournament, wins in the Engadine Open and the Swiss Open. It was the itinerary of a man discovering, tournament by tournament, country by country, that he could compete with anyone on earth. That same year, 1962, he married Verity Aldridge. It is a detail easy to skim past in a list of golfing achievements, and yet it sits at the center of everything that followed, because the marriage would go on to outlast careers, fashions, entire eras of the sport, without ever once becoming a story in itself. No public rupture, no scandal, no tabloid drama, just a private partnership that held steady while the man at its center spent decades living out of suitcases on 5 continents. There is a kind of quiet heroism in that sort of endurance that never makes the sports pages, and it deserves to be said plainly here. Whatever storms Bob Charles weathered in bunkers and playoffs, the home he returned to remained, by every account available, simply and steadily intact. Then came 1963, and the moment that turned a promising New Zealand professional into a name written permanently into the record books. Early in the year, he won the Houston Classic on the American Tour, the first PGA Tour event ever won by a left-handed golfer, itself no small thing. But it was what happened in July on the wind-swept links of Royal Lytham and St Anne's on England's Lancashire coast that changed everything. Picture the scene for a moment. The flat grey light off the Irish Sea, the wind combing sideways across dune grass and gorse, 4 rounds of golf compressed into a scoreline of 68, 72, 66 and 71 that left him locked at 277, dead level with the brash young American Phil Rogers, forcing a 36-hole playoff on the Saturday to decide the Open champion. What followed was not a shootout of long, thunderous drives, but a demonstration of nerve measured in inches. In the morning round of that playoff, Charles needed a mere 26 putts to go round the course. An almost unbelievable figure, the sort of number that separates a very good golfer from a man who, for 1 week of his life, simply could not miss. He needed 31 in the afternoon, and by the time the round was finished, he had won by 8 clear shots. He became, that afternoon, the first left-handed golfer ever to win a major championship, and to this day, he remains the only New Zealander to have lifted the claret jug. For a young country whose sporting identity had always been built on rugby paddocks and running tracks, here was proof that its golfers, too, could stand at the very summit of a game invented and jealously guarded by others. What is easy to forget, looking back from the distance of decades, is how long that record stood. It was not until 2003, when the Canadian Mike Weir won the Masters, that another left-hander claimed a major. Phil Mickelson followed a year later. For 40 years, Bob Charles stood entirely alone in that particular corner of the game's history, a fact that turns his achievement from a single golden afternoon into something closer to a lifelong sentence of solitary distinction, the only man of his kind to have done what he did for 4 decades running. It is worth asking what that sort of isolation does to a competitor. Does it sharpen the pride? Or does it simply become one more fact of life, carried lightly because there is no alternative but to carry it? The years immediately after Lytham brought no shortage of near misses to sit alongside the triumph. And it is in those near misses, arguably, that the deeper character of the man shows itself most clearly. In 1964, he finished third at the US Open. The following year, he won the Tucson Open on the American Tour. In 1966, he added the New Zealand Open and the Watties Open to his home country collection. In 1967 came the Atlantic Classic in America and the Caltex Open back home. Then, 1968 arrived, and with it, 2 occasions on which the second major of his career seemed to be within reach, only to slip away. A tied second at the PGA Championship, and at the Open Championship at Carnoustie, a finish that again left him agonizingly short of the very top. The following year, 1969, he was runner-up at the Open for the second year running, beaten this time by the young Englishman Tony Jacklin at Lytham, the same course where he had once stood as champion. That same season brought a compensation of sorts in the World Match Play Championship, one of the most prestigious events outside the 4 majors, which he won in a performance many judges of the game still rate among the finest of his career. In 1970, he finished third at the US Open once more. Across those years, he and Verity became parents, 2 children born into a life that must have felt, for a young family, permanently suspended between airports, hotel rooms, and the handful of weeks each year spent properly at home. How does a father explain to a small child that he will be gone again by the weekend, off to Carnoustie or Houston or Wentworth, chasing a small white ball around fields on the other side of the world? Charles never spoke of it as a hardship in the way some of his era's contemporaries later did of theirs. If there was strain in it, it was carried privately, inside a marriage that by every visible measure simply endured. He kept playing at the highest level through the first half of the 1970s. A 7th place finish at the 1973 Open, a 10th at the 1979 Open, a slow, unspectacular tapering that in retrospect looks less like decline and more like a man pacing himself for something longer than most careers in professional sport ever attempt. And here the story takes one of its stranger turns, because where most champions of the 1960s had, by the early 1980s, either retired outright or faded quietly from view, Bob Charles was only warming up for the second great act of his career. When the Senior Tour, later the Champions Tour, was established in America for golfers over 50, Charles did not merely participate in it. He dominated it in a way he had never quite dominated the regular tour in his prime. He finished top of the Senior Tour's money list in both 1988 and 1989, and won the Senior Byron Nelson Award in 1988, 1989, and again in 1993, an honor recognizing the tour's most consistent low scorer. By the time his senior career wound down, he had accumulated 25 victories on that circuit, a total that ranks him among the very best players the format has ever produced, tied for 4th on the all-time list. There is something almost mischievous in the symmetry of it. A man who spent his prime years finishing agonizingly second at major championships came back 30 years older and simply started winning at a rate he never quite managed as a younger man. Perhaps the sweetest single note in that second act came in 1993, when he won the Senior Open Championship, 30 years, almost to the week, since he had first won the Open itself, and on the very same stretch of Lancashire coastline at Lytham, where the young left-hander had once needed 26 putts to stun the golfing world. History does not often grant a man the chance to return, 3 decades on, to the exact scene of his greatest triumph and win there again. Bob Charles was granted precisely that, and took it, and still he kept going. In 2007, at 71 years of age, he made the cut at the New Zealand Open, the tournament he had first won 53 years earlier as a teenage amateur, and in the process beat his own age twice across the 4 rounds, a feat that borders on the surreal for anyone who has ever watched a 70-year-old body attempt to compress a golf swing into anything resembling its younger self. He did not finally step away from competitive golf until after the Senior Open Championship of 2010 at the age of 74, closing a competitive career that had by then run for the better part of 6 decades without interruption. Along the way, the honours accumulated in a steady, unhurried procession that mirrored the man himself. An OBE in the early 1970s, upgraded to a CBE in 1992, a knighthood in 1999, which turned the quiet former bank clerk from Carterton into Sir Robert James Charles. Induction into the World Golf Hall of Fame in 2008, the first left-handed player ever admitted to it. Appointment to the Order of New Zealand in 2011, one of the country's very highest honours, reserved for a mere handful of living New Zealanders at any one time. And, in 2016, an invitation to become an honorary member of the Royal and Ancient Golf Club of St Andrews, the sport's spiritual home, which does not extend that particular courtesy lightly. Away from the leaderboards, he turned his understanding of the game toward the design of golf courses across New Zealand, lending his name and his eye to layouts that would go on shaping how ordinary weekend golfers experienced the sport in his home country long after his own tournament rounds were finished. There is something fitting in that afterlife of a career. The boy who once had nothing but a spare set of borrowed clubs and a paddock course near Carterton, ending up as the man whose judgment now determines where the fairways run and where the greens are cut for generations of golfers who never saw him play a single competitive shot. What remains striking, turning over the whole span of this life, is how little of it reads as turbulent. Golf in his era, and in the decades either side of it, produced no shortage of champions whose brilliance on the course sat alongside chaos off it. Broken marriages, financial ruin, public feuding, the corrosive loneliness that so often follows a life spent chasing a small ball from one lonely hotel room to the next. Bob Charles's life, by every account that exists in the public record, does not fit that pattern. The marriage, begun in 1962, endured. The children were raised. The bank clerk's discipline that kept him amateur for 6 extra years, that saw him post 26 putts in a single round when everything was on the line, seems to have been the same discipline that carried him, largely unshaken, through 50 years in a sport that eats less steady men alive. Whether that outward calm concealed private struggles, the record has simply never surfaced. No one outside his own family could honestly say. What can be said is that he gave the game, and the country that produced him, remarkably little to worry about, and a great deal to be quietly proud of. He is in his 90th year now, dividing his time between Florida in the United States and Canterbury in New Zealand, the South Island region that has been home, in one form or another, since he left Christchurch behind as a young man. He is said to still play the game that made him famous, still capable, well into his 80s, of going round a course in a score lower than his own age. The same trick, performed decades later, that once made headlines when he was a supposedly aging 71-year-old at the 2007 New Zealand Open. A biography of his life was published only recently, more than 70 years after that first startling win at Heretaunga, evidence that the story still has an audience willing to sit with it. There is a particular kind of golfer, familiar to anyone who has spent long enough around club fairways on either side of the Tasman, who never announces himself, never needs the gallery's noise to know what he has done, and who measures a life's work not in headlines, but in rounds completed, in commitments kept, in a putting stroke that stayed reliable from a Weir paddock course in the 1950s to a Lancashire links in a knighted old age. Bob Charles was, by every visible sign, that golfer and that man both at once. The kind who could go 26 putts in a round when history was watching, and 40 years later still be found quietly walking 18 holes on a Canterbury course where nobody was watching at all. Because that, in the end, was simply what he did. Think for a moment of the distance travelled, from a counter in a small town bank in the Weir to the 18th green at Lytham, with the Lancashire wind coming in off the sea, to a senior open won on that same turf 30 years later, to an old man still walking 18 holes in his own country decades after his contemporaries had put their clubs away for good. Somewhere in Australia tonight, there will be a man old enough to remember exactly where he was when the news came through that a left-handed New Zealander had beaten Phil Rogers in a playoff at the Open. Old enough, perhaps, to remember Peter Thompson's own great years and to have felt something close to pride, even as a rival nation supporter, in watching a fellow son of the Tasman stand at the top of the game. That kind of memory does not ask to be summarized or concluded. It simply sits there, quiet and particular, the way the man himself always seemed to carry his own extraordinary life, without fuss, without complaint, and, as far as anyone outside his own front door will ever really know, largely at peace with all of it.